Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ingeborg Pelser from the Franschhoek Literary Festival, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's virtual event with international best-selling author Heather Morris, and I'm sure you'll all know well-known broadcaster and also writer Joanne Joseph. Now, it's incredible to have Heather with us tonight because, as I'm sure you all know, she's an international best-selling author. Her first book, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, has sold over 6 million copies worldwide, which is absolutely incredible. And the follow-up on that, Silka's Journey, has sold 1 million so far. And now Heather's just released the third installment in the series, a title called Three Sisters, which she will tell us more about in a moment. Heather is in Australia, so we're in different time differences, but so we're very, very happy that Heather could join us tonight. And then just also welcome to Joanne Joseph, who will be interviewing Heather. Joanne's just released her first novel, Children of Sugarcane, but she's well known as a broadcaster in South Africa, an MC. She teaches script writing, and her book in 2013, Drug Mules, was also a bestseller. So thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to all our FLF members and other members of the public. And just a short note to say thank you so much to our sponsors, Jonathan Bull Publishers and Porcupine Ridge, for making this event possible. This is a closed event, so we will unfortunately not take questions this evening, but you can still enjoy at least 45 minutes of a good conversation between Joanne and Heather. Thank you so much to you both, and over to you.
Ingeborg, thanks so much for that introduction. Really lovely to be with you this evening. And Heather Morris, what an honor to be able to interview you after this trilogy that I've really spent a lot of time reading over the last few years. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. There's, of course, a very interesting backstory to what set you off on this path to the third book in particular, Heather. Would you share that with us, please?
With pleasure, because it all started in Franschhoek. In 2019, I was having the most amazing time at the festival there, and I was getting a couple of text messages from my daughter back in Australia during one day saying, "Mum, there's an email you need to read." And then a couple of hours later, "Mum, have you read this email?" A couple of hours later, "If you don't read this email, I'm going to ring you up and read it to you." But I was out having a great time, and I wasn't back in my hotel room just sitting there reading emails. But when I did read that email at about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, well, it changed my life yet again. And it resulted in this book. Because in Franschhoek, I read an email from a man who lives in Canada, in Toronto. He had taken a copy of The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which Canada has the Australian cover. So it doesn't make much sense to people who don't have the same cover. But it's a simple black cover, 2 arms coming together from the elbow down, and the tattooed numbers of Lali and Gita. This gentleman left Canada and he took it to his mum, visiting her in Tel Aviv in Israel. He left it on her coffee table. She walked past the next day, looked at the book, and just said to him, "That must be about Lali and Gita." When he asked her, "How could you possibly know that?" She said, "Look at the number on the arm of that girl on the cover. Now look at the number on my arm. They're 3 away. Your Auntie Sibby's was 2 away. We went to school with Gita. We were on the train going to Auschwitz with Gita. We were standing in line to be tattooed with Gita." And from that email, which I read in Franschhoek in 2019, I subsequently flew not home from Johannesburg to Melbourne, but straight to Israel, straight into the apartment and the arms of Livia, one of the sisters, the youngest, and then into the extended family. And this incredible story was given to me.
So you already knew at that point, before you left South Africa, that you potentially had another book that was about to be born. If you landed in Israel and that story told itself to you in the same way Silka's Journey and The Tattooist of Auschwitz were told to you.
Yes and no. I realized that there was something, because I spoke to Livy on the phone. I think I was in Cape Town, giving you a little geography trip around South Africa, aren't I? And when I spoke to her, there was something in her voice. And she kept saying to me, "I need to see you. There's so much I can tell you about Lali and Gita," because she was in their lives. And Gita had actually visited and stayed with them in Israel. And so she wanted to tell me that. But the little bit I asked her about, just something sparked in me. And I knew, yes, I'd love to talk to you about Lali and Gita, but the book's written. I don't need to really hear anymore. But there was something else in her voice of this then 93-year-old lady that, yes, had me go, not knowing where it would end.
Heather, I'm astonished at how you have pulled these stories together, knowing how difficult it is to interview people who have suffered severe trauma. Part of it, perhaps part of the memory of it has been blotted out or affected over the years by what they've suffered. They're very elderly at this stage, as you say, in their 90s. You must be a very patient interviewer and writer to be able to get the best out of your interview subjects in order to translate their story into a beautiful book.
Look, I hope I don't offend you, Joanne, when I say to them, or say to you, I have never interviewed anybody in my life because I don't know how to interview. What I do is I just sit and listen to people and talk. I don't write notes. I don't record. My work in social work in a hospital in Melbourne for 20 years had me every day meeting people for whom something tragic or traumatic had happened in their lives. And the only way you can even think about helping them is to just listen to them. And my life has all been about listening to people on the off chance in that hospital setting I could help them with something. And it was just an extension of that with Lali and with the sisters and the families. I just sit and listen. And by just listening, I not only hear the words, I see the body language, I read the facial expressions, I hear the emotion behind the words as well as the words. So, yes, in terms of being able to do that, I've had many, many years training in a hospital, and it's what I love doing. I love talking to people. I love listening to people.
And of course, recording their stories in such a beautiful way. I want to focus on the plot for a moment here, please, Heather. Your book starts in Slovakia, a father extracting a promise from three of his very young daughters to look out for one another, to stick together no matter what happens in the future. How does that shape their relationships as the story begins to unfold?
Well, utterly. You've got to remember that Libby, the youngest, she was only 3 at the time, but her 2 oldest sisters still to this day, Magda, who's still alive as well, remind her of that promise to their papa. The significance of that cannot be underestimated. And I'm happy to give away this little storyline that why it's so significant is that the day after those 3 young girls, 3, 5, and 7, sat in the garden and promised their papa that they would look after each other, that they would stay together, he died the next day. And so that, of course, added that extra dimension of, connectiveness between these girls. And so all their lives, and that continues to today, because Libby and Magda are both still alive in Israel. And, that still exists. We made a promise to Papa.
But that request takes on quite a different meaning as the Nazis, of course, gain power in various parts of Europe, in Slovakia in particular, and these sisters are drawn one by one into this web at Birkenau, in certain cases of their own free will. One sister wanting to accompany the other, not wanting a younger sister to go off without her. What a promise to have to keep under these particular circumstances.
Yeah, it is, Joanne, but here's the thing. They made a promise to stay together as 3. Now, over the many, many decades, these girls have continued to grow up and have families. There's been this underlying thing with Magda. And why I'm saying this is 2 of them got taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau in April 1942. Magda was not taken at the same time because she was in hospital and missed being rounded up. She existed for 2.5 years with her mother and grandfather back in Slovakia. For Magda, the guilt of not being with her sisters for 2.5 years, of sleeping in her own bed, not knowing where her sisters were, but of course when she ultimately found herself in Auschwitz-Birkenau too, and that they could meet there. This horrific place with 100,000 odd prisoners in it, kept separated, and they found each other 2.5 years later, only with a matter of days after Magda coming. So Magda has that, and call it survivor guilt, whatever you want, of not having been there. And yet for Libby and Sippy, they were thankful that she wasn't there, that maybe one of them now could survive, because the odds of them surviving were pretty slim.
The issue of survivor's guilt comes through in more than one thread, Heather. On the one hand, you've got Magda, who feels incredibly guilty because she hasn't joined her sisters and kept this promise made to her father and to both her sisters. On the other hand, you've also got the more generalized survivor's guilt that all of them, as older people, still bear, knowing that they lived through this massive amount of suffering, this traumatic experience, and were one of the few to come out, or some of the few to come out of it alive.
Yes, and very rare for three sisters or siblings to survive. I've met many, many survivors in many, many countries. And of course, they're all that same generation. They were all teenagers or young adults when they were taken there. And for the vast majority of them, they are alone because the other family members, in one case, another three sisters taken from Bratislava. I know one of the sisters, and sadly she died aged 97 earlier this year, but she was taken with her two sisters, and she held those other two sisters as they died 5 days apart. That was the norm. So for three of them to survive is very, very rare. I don't know. They put it down to luck. Every survivor says they were just lucky. You were lucky when you stood on that line at selection, whether that person sent you to the left or the right. You had no say in it.
Heather, the suffering at Birkenau is really unspeakable. But of course, you're not writing in a vacuum here. And I'm very, very interested in your treatment, because I'd venture to say hundreds of books have probably been written about the Holocaust, if not thousands by now. Yeah. How do you distinguish the way you tell your story from the rest of that body of work?
Look, I simplified it, Joanne, a couple of years ago when it occurred to me when occasionally you get some criticism, and that's fine, everyone's allowed to criticize, that I was telling these stories that wasn't the norm. And I kept thinking back to my time with Lully and why he spoke to me and why he wanted me to tell his story. And it came to me that I'm not writing the story of the Holocaust. I'm just writing a Holocaust story. In his case, Lully and Gita, and now these three sisters. And for me, that's actually quite sort of liberating. It means that whether people like it or not, these are individual stories. Funnily enough, the survivors I've met who had read Lully's story, of course, because this one's just coming out, so many in so many countries have come up and thanked me for telling the story. And they say to me, in telling Lully and Gita's story, you've told mine. And it's almost like I no longer need to keep talking about it. It's done. That's my story.
I've got to dwell for a moment on your treatment here, because I find this aspect of it incredibly interesting. There must always be a dilemma as a writer as to whether you depict the extent of the horror at Auschwitz, or whether you filter that somewhat in your interpretation of events. And I mean, I experienced much the same thing writing my book about South African indenture. But my book does exist almost in a vacuum, where there's very little literature about it. And so I had to make that difficult choice of how much violence I was actually going to depict in order not to dress the story up or filter the elements too much. Do you grapple with that? Have you grappled with that over the writing of these three stories, where you say it's difficult to get that balance right? How much horror do I show? Do I weigh up horror with hope? What is that conversation inside your head like?
That's the challenge, isn't it? You can't ignore it. You can't gloss over it and just have this story of these sisters existing there without depicting what it is they're existing in. I thought, for me, I learned how to write screenplays from a very amateur perspective. And the one thing I constantly take from that learning, those workshops and seminars that I did on screenwriting, and I heard that that's something that you're involved in. And there's the one phrase that keeps coming into my head: remember the emotional arcs. Don't stay down too long. Don't stay up too long. And so I'm all about trying to find that balance. You have to describe, as the best you can, the evil and horror that's going on, but then look for something else to immediately back it up with. And with these girls, as with Lully, there were plenty of things to be able to then flip out from that evil and then look at the individuals around them and the hope and the love that they're offering. So it was always just finding that balance in that emotional arcs of the storyline. And I was lucky that I had plenty of them. And yeah, but I'm never going to shy away from, and I'm not going to sugarcoat what it was these girls were going through. No way. It was evil personified, just like the stories that you're obviously telling too.
Heather, that's something that characterizes all of your books. And of course, it's more obvious in the stories of hope. But I mean, these stories of Auschwitz that you tell, and you talk about that emotional arc and how you balance the horror with the hope. The stories do end up leaving you with a sense of hope at the end of them. I don't know how you do it, because if one actually thinks back on it, I mean, processing what actually goes on in these books is horrific. On a level afterwards, when you play over those events in your head, you imagine and try to empathize with the women caught up in this story. It really leaves a huge and painful impression on you as a reader. But yet, at the end of the story, you're left with just that ability to breathe and say, something good came out of this. We learned something about the triumph of the human spirit over what happened at Auschwitz.
The word hope that you said, that is a word for me that has incredible significance. And it goes back to what I did in my working career here as well. It's a word that we use all the time. Oh, I hope I win the lottery. Oh, I hope I can get to the movies. I mean, we use that word and it's a bit of a throwaway word. But can I tell you from my perspective, it's more than that. Working where I did in a hospital, there wouldn't be a day go by that I didn't hear either a patient or a family member say to me, oh, I hope my father can last long enough to walk me down the aisle. Oh, I hope my mother can live to see my child, her first grandchild born. I hope my son, suffering from terminal cancer at the age of 14, can live long enough to be able to be a man. And for me, the word hope is more than I hope I win the lottery. It's if I'm looking for that in my stories, and it is there in spades, because these girls, they clung to it. Lully clung to it.
I couldn't help but wonder whether the sisters would have survived Birkenau had they not been together.
I don't think Libby said she wouldn't have. Now, she was 15 and she was the only one that was meant to go. So picture this 15-year-old girl in 1942 in small town Slovakia. She was the baby. They called her Kitten. And everyone protected her and looked after her. She is adamant that if her older sister Sibby didn't volunteer to go, oh, she's not going without me, that she wouldn't have. But the wonderful thing about their storyline is while Sibby kept Libby, this young thing, going and kept her alive and looked after her, there came times during that 2.5 years when Sibby, because of illness or other things, she lost a little bit of hope. She lost her faith. That this younger sister then had to step up and provide her with now the hope. And the sisters, their whole lives, they've told me, and I've interpreted from their actions, that's what they've done their whole lives. When one was down, one of the others stepped up. In particular, it played out on the death march. And Magda, who hadn't been with them that long, she brought with them to these two girls who were now at the point of no longer thinking they would survive, but they were now together as the three of them, and so it didn't matter. I mean, what is survival if you don't have your family to share it with? But Magda brought with her memories and the stories of their life back in Slovakia, because she had only recently left it. And so that then changed that dynamic about who now is propping up who. And they tell me they still do that to this day, Libby and Magda.
It's really powerful. I mean, let's talk about the death march a little bit. Once they depart the camp, of course, that death march is what they must embark upon to get back to Slovakia. Before they get there and discover they're not welcome, there's some beautiful moments. I mean, there's that moment, for example, where they walk into this house, which was it's well, I wouldn't say in ruins, but there's a layer of dust over everything, which goes to show that the people have not inhabited it for some time. And there's a grand dining room with tables, but they choose not to eat indoors.
Yeah.
They take that table outside and they choose to eat in the outdoors under the stars. It was a beautiful moment in the book.
They said they did that out of respect to the owners. They knew that house wasn't theirs. They didn't want to take advantage of it. This was something they described as a castle. It was huge with several stories and multiple bedrooms. But yes, they could not eat inside somebody else's house. And so these girls, there was more than just the three of them at that point, carried it outside thinking, oh, hopefully the owners won't mind if we sit out here. First time they'd sat at a table in over 3 years.
It's something quite miraculous about that. Of course, once they get back to Slovakia, they discover they're still not welcome there as Jews. They have to make a new home for themselves, ultimately in Israel. So on the one hand, they're safe. They find a safe place in their spiritual home. On the other hand, they're still in a kind of exile from their geographical home. Does that impact them in their old age, Heather?
Oh, no, they're very happy living in Israel. And the delightful thing that I've been able to tell in telling their story about their time moving to Israel is being able to tell it from the perspective of young boys and girls, because that's where they met their husbands, or two of them. And it was at that pivotal point in history when the state of Israel was being created. There's so much been written about it from the military and the United Nations and the politicians, and that perspective. To be able to sit, and I'm not sure I did that justice, to hear them talk about what it was like for them as these young girls, or young women now, arriving there and being part of it, being in the life of the first president of Israel, working for him and knowing him. I mean, what an honor. Ordinary people living in extraordinary times across both those spans.
Their lives truly are extraordinary, and yet in a way they maintain, or they continue to live with the remnants of what happened to them. I saw an interview, a short clip of an interview with Livia as a 90-something-year-old woman. I think she's about 95 when she does that interview, and she says she still goes to Birkenau when she falls asleep each night. I mean, it's clear that after all these years she still remains deeply traumatized. How did you deal with subjects of this nature who suffered such trauma and very likely have to return to that place in the telling of it with you?
The one thing I learned many years ago when I was talking to Lully, and I spoke to a friend who was a psychiatrist about, was I doing him harm in talking with him and having him tell me this past life, this horrific past life. And he was very clear, nobody will ever tell you something they don't want you to know. I've known that going along, and you're right. And here's Livy, and what she said to me is a slight variation on what you've sort of seen her saying. Every night I lie down in my bed in Israel and I go to sleep in Birkenau every night. But here's the thing about Livy in particular, because we're talking about her. She is one of the people I know who loves to laugh the most. She giggles like a schoolgirl. Yes, of course, when she's talking to me, it's painful to be with her at one level, but I know she wants to talk to me, otherwise she wouldn't tell me. But then it doesn't take much for me to flick a switch in her and have her laughing, because she laughs an awful lot. And but the joy her great-grandchildren now bring to her is incredible to see.
Heather, I'm also, you spoke a little bit earlier on about your process, and I thought I would come back to that, because I find it really intriguing how you can simply listen and go back and translate. And by translate, I mean interpret what you're hearing as well. And some people would say, well, is that really an accurate process? Are you getting everything down in the language in which the survivor has told it to you, in the tone? Are you able to go back and verify everything that you have written down? Or is that simply part of the process of writing creative nonfiction for you?
Lolly's son said to me after he read the copy of the manuscript before it went to the printers, "How did you get my mother so well when you never met her?" By listening to Lolly for all those years he's in my life talk about Gita, the love of his life, I kind of got her, because I heard what he said. And so for his son to say that was a huge thing for me. Before Three Sisters went to the printers, the manuscript got sent to the families. The two surviving sisters, the three girls, each had 2 children. They now have multiple adult grandchildren, and every member of this extended family got sent the manuscript to look at, to comment on, and to tell me if they wanted anything changed or where I'd got anything wrong. I tried to tell them that, look, at this point in time, it hasn't been fully edited, so there's going to be misspellings, a punctuation, and grammar. Don't worry about that. But one of the 2 of them were really, really funny. They kind of didn't get that memo by the look of it, because they still wanted to tell me, I think you should have a comma after this. It was really quite delightful. But Joanna, can I tell you, there was only one scene that I got the message back from Livy and Magda, "You got it wrong. This is not right." And I looked at what they were talking about, and it was the one setup where I let my own personal emotions interfere with my writing. Normally, I'm pretty good at that. I can disassociate when I'm writing. I just write the words. They're just words on the screen. They only impact me when I read them, but not when I'm writing them. And I'm happy to share the scene that I got so wrong, and this is perhaps a bit of a lesson to anybody else doing this, to be aware of every now and then your own emotions can get in the way, and mine did. When the girls got to the Allies in Germany, into a displaced persons camp, and were there for weeks before they were then sent back to Slovakia. So in these displaced person camps, all people were separated into the countries of origin. And on this day, 4 busloads of young Czechoslovakian boys and girls were taken from Germany to Prague. As they approached that incredible bridge that leads you into the streets, into the walled city of Prague, people were lining the streets. They were lining the bridge. They lined the streets all the way into the square in Prague. They threw flowers at the buses. When the buses stopped, people jumped on board and pressed food and money into the hands of these returning survivors. And Livy and Magda told me about this. I'd listened to Sibby on her show a tape talk about it. But when I was writing it, I got angry. I got so angry. And for me, it was a matter of, how dare you? How dare you think that you can send these people away to die, and you can now be held responsible or not, I don't care, for the fact that they no longer have any family. And you think you can now welcome them back, and that a silver dollar or a flower will fix it? And for me, it was no, I couldn't let that go. And I wrote it in that tone. And Livy and Magda wrote back to me and said, "You got it all wrong. That was the happiest day of our life. We came home. We came home."
That is really, that's an astonishing admission on your part, and a confession as a writer, as to what I think all writers writing the kind of genre that you are grappling with on a daily basis, because there is a part of yourself in that writing, although it is the story of these 3 sisters. How do you distance yourself, Heather? Because it is such an emotional story, and a story that evokes such deep anger at times, fear at times, compassion at times, a range of emotions for the reader. I can't imagine that as a writer, you are not having to filter those emotions either, as you put it down on paper.
Oh, absolutely. But once again, my training in the hospital setting to be able to help the people that I was helping there, it was drilled into us very, very clearly. And you just took it on because it makes sense once you know it. That when you're sitting with somebody who has been through a tragic or traumatic time, you have to remember it is not your pain, it is not your trauma, it is not your guilt. And you have no right to think you can own any part of it. And you cannot help someone in a hospital setting like I was in, help somebody tell their story if you think you can take it away from them. You can't. It's not going to happen. You just can listen to them, hear them as well. Totally different thing. And from there, you don't accept it. And, you don't totally, by the way, cut yourself off. I mean, I'm not that hard-hearted. And as I said to you, I can sit there and write all this without batting an eyelid, detached from the words as I'm writing them. I struggle to read my own writing. That's when I break down.
Yeah, I'm hearing you say that in the genre in which you're writing, when you're telling the stories of other people's lives, that and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you seem to see yourself as a mere conduit to getting the story out into the world, rather than taking ownership of it in a huge way.
100%. Very clear here. These may be my books, but they're not my stories. I don't own any part of the story. I am literally that person who's been entrusted and honored to tell it, but never my story.
And Heather, it occurred to me when I was reading all three of these books that people would often go to people who share a similar heritage with them, because they assume that a writer with similar heritage, whose family has been through the same trauma, is more likely to be able to tell that story in a particular way, because perhaps there's automatically more empathy there. That is the assumption many people make. And so it intrigues me that this man from Israel contacted you to say, I would like you to tell my mother's story. What is it like being let into a world that ordinarily might not be yours, but also being entrusted with something that is so of such weight and of such deep importance to a group of people who've been severely hurt and traumatized by the reality of the Holocaust?
87-year-old Lali Sokolov, grieving the loss of his wife, he summed it up on that first or second time I met him, when I asked him, why were you wanting somebody who wasn't Jewish to tell or to listen to? I didn't know if he had a story. I had no idea. And he couldn't tell a story, to save himself. That's why I was dealing with him for many, many months. But he was very clear. There could not be a Jewish person alive, he said, who wasn't touched by the Holocaust. They don't exist. How can somebody tell my story when they've got their own baggage, even if it wasn't their direct baggage? So for him, that was his reason for wanting to speak to someone who wasn't Jewish. I've had the privilege of speaking at Jewish communities and synagogues all around the world. And without exception, I'm greeted with, Lali was a wise man. Lali knew what he was doing, and having you tell his story, which is our story, because you can write it in a way that non-Jewish people can read and relate to.
How important was that aspect? Because I'd not thought of it in that way before. But penetrating a community that in some ways has become very closed because of what happened to them can't be easy. How have you accessed that community? Coming from what is potentially an entirely different world to the reality that they have experienced over generations because of the Holocaust.
Well, that community actually access me now. That they seek me out. So far this week, I've spoken into Jewish communities on Zoom just in the last 2 days, into about 3 or 4 different Jewish communities in the United States, hungry to have me speak some more about the Holocaust and to hear their stories, because it's also their stories. That they embrace me and welcome me into their synagogues. I got to speak at a synagogue in Sydney. It was a synagogue that at one point all the women had to leave and only men were allowed to remain. And I was asked to remain and speak to the men in the synagogue. Very rare to happen. Look, I honestly don't know the correct answer to it, Joanne. It's a matter of they're people, I'm people. Let's just get to know each other and work together and spreading the story so that it is never forgotten.
But Heather, perhaps you're playing the power of that down somewhat, because here I am sitting at the southern tip of Africa, and I, through your book, have been able to access the story of someone I ordinarily would not be able to touch in real life, right? She lives in a country far away from me. The story of her life and her trauma and her sisters and her family and what they've managed to preserve of themselves is geographically quite far removed from my reality. It's socioculturally quite removed from my reality. And yet there's something quite healing about it, because there are people all over the world whose ancestors have suffered similar trauma. It may not have played out in exactly the same way, but there is pain. There is tragedy in history all over the world that has perhaps traveled intergenerationally. And young people today are still nursing that. Talk to me about people from other communities and their response to this book, Heather.
Yes, it was a really interesting question in terms of, I don't speak Slovakian, I don't speak Hebrew. I travel to many, many European countries where I try desperately to learn how to say the word thank you, at the very least, in their language. I'm shocker at it. So I can say to you, "Žakujem," which is thank you in Slovakian, because it's one country I go to. It's almost like people want their stories told. People want to read other people's stories. Now, in terms of the simplicity and how I write and what makes them relatable, I've read many, many books, and I've tried and finished other books on the Holocaust that have been written by Jewish men and women and about their family. And I struggle at the point in those narratives where they say Jewish prayers, they use phrases that are just so specifically Jewish. And I hit that in the storyline, and I go, well, I don't know what that means. So for Jewish readers, of course, they can embrace the entire story. I get stuck in having to go and have a look up and see what that prayer means, or why are you having dinner like this? What is the significance of rituals you're carrying out? Because I don't have any in my stories. So it does enable readers who are not Jewish to read the story without having to think about the culture and the religion behind it. And look, I'm not sure if that answers your question, because yes, you're right, it's just not about religion, it's about other cultures. And here in Australia, and I think the same as South Africa, many, many survivors from throughout Europe came to our respective countries. And here they had to mix. In Melbourne, large Slovakian and Polish survivors. Up in Sydney, the Hungarians more went to there. Over in Perth, there's a different ethnic or cultural countries survivors went to. But they then had to mix together there themselves. And so by those different cultures getting together, they then enabled me to come into it, because I'm not just talking to Slovakians or Polish or Hungarian.
Heather, a final question about the transformative nature of writing. I think it's probably more obvious to us how good books transform readers and how they begin to absorb and internalize different perspectives when reading books about historical events of this nature. Can you give me a sense of how the writer is transformed by the process of bringing these books into being?
Well, it shows up my small town New Zealand education system is lacking. I can say that. And it's a case of you never stop learning, folks. And I love learning. I love being with people. Clearly, that's my profession, to that. How has it transformed me? It takes me to incredible places around the world. It introduces me to amazing people. And I'm not talking about celebrities, but I'm talking about the ordinary people who come to hear me talk and then want to talk to me afterwards. And I love that. I have just done it today, this afternoon, for the first time in 18 months, spoken to a live audience. But I'm still grandma when it all comes down to it.
Heather, very accomplished grandma indeed, and thank you for sharing these stories with us and bringing them into the world. It's such an important preservation of history, but also you've just told these stories in the most human way, the most accessible way possible, and I want to thank you for that. Heather Morris, author of the trilogy. You might remember having read The Tattooist of Auschwitz first, followed by Silke's Journey. If you haven't, those are standalone novels that you can also read, but the third in that trilogy is The Three Sisters, a beautiful novel. Indeed, very moving. Heather Morris, such a privilege talking to you this evening. Thank you.
Joanne, folks, everyone at Friendship, it has been my honor. It has been my privilege. I can't wait, and I hope you invite me back in person.
Thank you so, so much to both of you. It was incredible to talk. I wish we had a lot more time. I mean, I feel there are so many themes that you've explored, Joanne. Thank you so much for that, and Heather. I do want to read to you a review that's already appeared of Three Sisters that I just feel really captures Heather's writing and what she's doing with her writing so well. It says, Heather Morris has fast built her credentials as a warrior of remembrance, which I think is beautifully written, retelling these tales of hope and survival, an exultant celebration of family love and the irrepressible will to survive. Three Sisters is a heartbreaking yet uplifting and triumphant tale, which I think really, really captures it. And the book is available in South Africa. It's launched in the last 2 weeks. So please go out and buy it. And Heather, we would love to welcome you back at Franschhoek.
Yes.
I hope everything opens up and becomes easier for all of us, and that we can have you back next year or the year thereafter. And thank you so, so much for your time this evening, and good luck with the rest of your publicity tour. I hope you can get out more easily now in Australia and get the word out. But, you know, I really, really appreciate your time. And thank you, Joanne. And please follow our newsletter on flf.co.za for our last virtual event that we'll have with Ken Follett in next month in November. And then watch out for our program that will release soon at the beginning of next year. Thank you so, so much to you both.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Ball. Thank you, Jonathan Ball. And thank you, Paul Heinrich.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.